Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As we approach midlife, many of us face a lot of turmoil and tribulation, and we try to find ways to navigate that interesting web and labyrinth that causes a lot of pain and suffering. Sometimes it's a little bit too much and we never seem to climb out of it. We always look for a way to find the light out of the darkness. Joining us on the Beyond 50 radio program today is somebody who produces something that just might help things get a little bit better. She's going to be providing with us the Trauma Tool Kit. It's healing post-traumatic stress disorder from the inside out. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our wonderful guest, Susan Pease Bannett. Susan, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Oh, thank you. Good morning.
How did you start doing all this?
Oh, how did I start doing all this? I, in high school, became very fascinated with the mind after I read Freud, and also had done an internship with autistic children, and I became fascinated with psychology at that point, and decided to switch from pre-med to psychology, and rest is history. Ended up taking a lot of jobs, and one after the other was more interesting, and I ended up working a lot with highly traumatized populations. But I grew up also in an alcoholic and dysfunctional home and had my own issues to deal with. So I think a lot of us who go into psychology come from backgrounds like that.
It always seems interesting how that actually helps us grow, but in the moment we don't seem to understand that.
Yeah, well.
How come they get to have the rosy-colored lifestyle over there, but, I'm stuck with this? And then you end up being the person that everybody looks to saying, geez, how did you get this all figured out? I wished I had that. You realize their life wasn't as rosy as you thought.
Well, that's very true. I think I just saw myself as less able to repress things than other people. So I actually had to deal with them early, and I did. I got into therapy quite early in life, which helped give me a head start for some of this stuff. But after all the years, I started to realize that trauma was underlying a lot of disorders, and it took me a long time to figure that out because in the mid-'80s, I had started my work in the early 80s. In the mid-'80s, we were just starting to talk about abuse in the field. Things like sexual abuse and emotional abuse really weren't talked about much in the 70s. And so it was the mid-'80s that this came to our attention, and then didn't really hit mass consciousness until even later than that.
Now, it's really interesting because, like you said, we weren't talking a lot about these things, but it seems that people this day and age can't seem to talk enough about it. Why is that?
I think because of the prevalence. For 4 years in Boston, I worked on the Child at Risk Hotline, which is the child abuse service that covers the whole state after hours. So when DSS closes down for the day, the hotline goes on, and I was a supervisor there for 4 years. And you just can't imagine the amount of abuse that's happening out in the community. It's not reported on, and the statistics aren't even reported on. So, every month that went by, we watched an increase in abuse from 1988 to 1992 approximately was when I was working there. And it was appalling to me. And I think that this discovery, in a way, this willingness to look at and talk about it is absolutely vital to change this in our culture. This is nothing new in cultures. This is very ancient. There's even writings in Roman times. I mean, we have improved. We don't leave babies on hillsides anymore like they did in Rome. But there's still quite a lot of abuse that's just almost normative. I hate to use that word, but when you look at the statistics, it's almost normative. And if we can get a handle on interrupting that cycle, and people can start healing their traumas and even acknowledging that they had them, the whole world could change overnight.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible that a person can heal from something like a traumatic stress? And what is the difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma?
That's a good question. Okay, I'm going to answer the second question first. So the difference between trauma And PTSD is PTSD is a psychiatric diagnosis that requires certain criteria, which have just been revised actually in the DSM-5. So you have to have all of these things of intrusiveness through flashbacks and nightmares, and it affects your mood. It creates what we call dysphoric mood or an unhappy, anxious mood, and it interferes with the functioning of one's life to greater or lesser degrees. Anyway, there's a whole list of criteria that I won't bore your audience with, but most of us have trauma at some point. It doesn't necessarily always become a full-blown case of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. But in the short term, the symptoms can look a lot alike, actually. And the tools that I put in the toolkit are to manage any kind of traumatic stress. So it doesn't have to be PTSD. I actually didn't have PTSD in the original title because I wanted people to feel it was accessible. But then I realized if I didn't put it in the title, it wouldn't get it wouldn't show up as much in search engines, and that the people who most needed it were people with PTSD.
Mm-hmm. Now, how has putting all this together actually helped people?
I get regular calls from people saying that this book has changed their life or has really helped them get a handle on something or has helped people around them understand what they're going through. Word is still just getting out about this book. It's been out for a year. And the question you had asked before, which I didn't answer, was, can people heal fully from PTSD? And my belief to that answer is yes, and that belief is based in my own experience, and it's based in the experience of people I've worked with as well. But there's a very common thought out there. A lot of therapists are telling their clients that you can't heal from PTSD, that you have to live with it your whole life. I've heard this for years, and I'm here to tell you it's not true. But working in the traditional ways, it is true. If you only work with the mind, or if you only have a once-a-week therapy, you're not likely to overcome your PTSD and traumatic stress. Mm-hmm. But if you work all these different layers that I talk about in the book, that include the energy body in particular, you are much more likely to be able to clear the whole thing up. And the degree of severity doesn't seem to matter. It's more a question of how, over what period of time do you consistently apply these principles of healing.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, too, because you consider when somebody sits in front of a therapist and they talk about what it is that's really eating away at them. It could be somebody who's a veteran, like we're seeing a lot of that happening this day and age, one-on-one about their experiences, feeling and going into the pain, but as you said, it's only once a week, and that just doesn't seem to do the trick. What makes what you have provided here in your trauma toolkit different? What are some of the steps that make what happens when they pursue this different from traditional ways of healing trauma?
Well, for one thing, I have a lot of things, exercises and techniques and even supplements and things that you can do at home. So these are things that you can do on a daily basis. I give a lot of exercises. I have a whole chapter on first aid. If you are in the middle of a full-blown panic attack, full-blown trauma that you just can't get a handle on, I have a whole chapter devoted to things that I've used with myself and with other people that I know work. For example, breathing patterns and breathing exercises and clearing techniques, energetic clearing techniques, which may seem strange to the Western mind, things like smudging or crystals, but things that I've used that have actually kept people out of the emergency room, which is huge. Mm-hmm. Patients would often call me, and they'd be in the midst of a big memory hitting or just really feeling gacked out, as somebody put it, and I'd say, take an Epsom salt bath and use this oil and smudge yourself and call me in 15 minutes and tell me how you're doing, and they'd call back and they'd say, well, it's still there, but it's manageable now, and I don't feel like I need to go to the emergency room. So that's huge. When I started realizing that I had these tools in my practice, I became very passionate about wanting to share them because they were so simple. I mean, these things are not, they're not complicated. It's not complicated to go take a hot Dead Sea salt bath.
Mm-hmm.
But who thinks of that when they're in the middle of a trauma?
Right.
Right?
Especially if they can play with a saltfish, or a rubber duck.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll bring out the inner children.
Well, and there it is I think sometimes that we, take life too seriously, and we forget that, life is to be enjoyed. But, somebody who has had a trauma, especially a really severe one, they tend to forget about that. And, the human spirit is very resilient, and I'm sure that you've experienced that, especially with extreme trauma cases. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the human spirit it's extraordinary how resilient people are. I mean, I've worked with people who had torture in their background, growing up as children, ritual abuse, found wandering the streets of the city at 2 years old because their parent was strung out on heroin. And these people, they definitely have more struggles than the average person, but when they apply themselves with somebody who's knowledgeable, their life gets just a whole lot better, and the tenacity of wanting to heal is important to cultivate that in oneself. Or if there are therapists listening, it's important to cultivate that will to live and move through it. And I've been blessed working here in Portland, Oregon, because so many of the people who came to see me already had a spiritual path or a spiritual affinity. I write in the book about this patient who found me, and she had so much trauma that we really couldn't talk about anything without her getting triggered and disappearing for a couple of weeks at a time. So our session would be like, we'd have a session, she'd disappear for a week, we'd have another session, she'd disappear for 3 weeks, she'd come back and have another session. And then one day she brought in the Tao of Pooh, or the Tao of Piglet, I forget which one. But anyway, a spiritual book, and we started just talking about spiritual concepts. And she didn't get triggered the whole hour, and she loved it. She loved it. And so I just made this sort of novel idea of I wasn't going to try to do anything resembling traditional therapy at all with her. I wanted to build on her sense of spirit and spiritual presence.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the next almost 3 years, we talked about every spiritual text there was. She was very bright. Even though she hadn't been to college, she was a very bright young woman. And she read everything from the Bhagavad Gita to Nietzsche. She would go into the library and write down affirmations and bring them home, put them up on her walls. And, slowly she started to extricate herself from these very bad relationships she was in and the drug use that she was in. She started to extricate herself enough that we could start to actually process some of her trauma and help get her on her feet. And it was very powerful for her to do that. And so when I talk in the book about finding the core beneath the core, this place to stand inside of oneself where there's no injury, where there's only divine being, even if people can't feel it, and who can, even those of us who don't have that level of wounding. I mean, it's hard in this world to find that place, but just to know that it exists or that there's a possibility of it existing even is an extremely powerful intervention, because people with a lot of trauma, especially a lot of developmental childhood trauma, feel completely broken. They feel utterly outcast. They feel like pariahs, A lot of them develop a secondary case of social anxiety, so it's hard for them to get the support they need from peers in the world, et cetera.
And that's so true. I mean, we try to reach out to the people we hope will be able to reach back and make us feel, I guess, whole, to feel accepted, to feel loved, respected. And, it seems that we've developed a world, especially here in the United States, of competitiveness, of looking over across the neighbor's fence and realizing that we are less than what they are. And that isn't good enough, And
our TV tells us that 24/7.
Right.
Our TV tells us constantly the only message that commercial TV has is you're not good enough. Mm-hmm. That is the only way you can get people to buy things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the anxiety that it certainly creates. Tell me about, in fact, for our listeners, what are one or two simple steps they could take listening to this show, that might be able to help them on their way to remove anxiety and to get out of the illusion of feeling that they are less than. Because, as suggested on this program, we say, by now you've pretty much heard it all, or at least you believe you have anyway, especially in a day and age of persuasion. And, the truth is the human spirit, we come into this world, we're whole, we're perfect, we have everything we'll ever need to solve any problem that we ever encounter. But a lot of times we get lost, and, when you take a look at, for instance, search engines like YouTube, the top searches are for things that tell us how to do things that we can either figure out how to do or should already know how to do.
Mm-hmm.
Were we ever cross that line to the point where we just don't believe we could solve problems on our own?
Well, right, and I feel like 50, it's interesting that your show's called Beyond 50, because I think that, 52 in the Mayan calendar is the age of full adulthood, which I love that you're really not considered a full adult till you're 52. And that 50s are a great time to take that, to kind of look around and say, half the world is younger than I am now, or more than half the world is younger than I am now, and I'm kind of the expert here, and giving ourselves permission to own what we know, and also permission to fill in the blanks of what we don't know, to have enough humility and maybe let go of that competitive self that drove us through our 30s and 40s, and develop some humility and look around and say, if I'm still suffering, maybe there's some things I haven't figured out yet, and take the time. In India, they have these stages of life laid out, and they are the brahmacharan, the celibate student, so to speak, the householder, and then after householder, they have the vanaprasthan, which is the forest dweller. And the idea, and these are, of course, ancient categories, but they still hold a sort of interesting, loose guide if we want to become wise, insightful people. And that's the idea that when you're done with the busyness or winding down with the busyness of raising a family and supporting a family, that it's time to kind of retreat into oneself a bit, to walk into the woods, metaphorically,
right,
and see what isn't resolved, and see because here's the problem: if you don't do that, whatever is there, it's going to get more magnified as time goes on, and that can be true in the case of abuse and traumatic memories. I had a friend whose father, at the age of 90, started remembering sexual abuse from his childhood, and it was terribly sad because he was so old and frail. He just didn't have the resources to deal with it at all. But our memory compartments do break down as we age. So if we haven't, done that cleanup in our earlier part of our life, then the 50s and beyond become a really good time to say, okay, now it's time to clean up the mess,
right,
and to see what my legacy is. And it's never too late to get help, just like we've proven through studies, it's never too late to go to the gym and start lifting weights. People in their 80s and 90s can get results from that. It's never too late to be working with our own mind either. And so exercises like meditation are incredibly powerful and helpful for helping that healing process along.
What excites you the most about the work that you do?
Nobody's ever asked me that question before. Oh, I love, so there's so much of it. For me, this is a very long string. Okay, so this is something that's culminated. This is generations of dysfunction that have culminated in this life for this person. And, if they have children themselves, they're going to be stretching out into the future with their lineage. But if they don't have children, they're also going to know, hundreds of people over their lifetime they're going to affect. And the more that we clear ourselves and become the kind, loving, wise humans that we can become, the more impact we can have on the world. And so I tell my students, this work is not just about the past. It's about the future. If you take one person and you turn around their trauma and they're able to manifest their gifts into the world, you have affected generations of people. And in the book I write about how I believe that trauma is the kernel for a lot of the woes of the world. So if you have untreated trauma, people have trouble in relationships, and they become paranoid and self-protective, and then they have trouble in their communities. And then the communities can have trouble, and then it can grow to states and nations and wars and things. There's some research that's been done that show that some of the least functional nations have the highest amounts of. And that was a good work of Lloyd Demouse. So I'm passionate about healing from trauma because I think if there's anything that can heal the world, I think it's this idea about healing traumas of all kinds, and that we have to get over this idea that war is a solution, that war is a valid solution to problems. Because war causes more problems than it solves, always. And it saddens me when I see these good young men and women go in with noble ideals, and they come out completely broken and disillusioned and frustrated with the government, and why was I there, and nobody told me it was going to be this bad. You cannot wage war in a way that's helpful.
No.
You just can't. It's always going to cost us. It's going to cost us karmically. It's going to cost us financially. It's going to cost us emotionally. And there's a new concept being talked about in the trauma communities around veterans right now, this concept of moral injury. Moral injury. It's never really been talked about before, but this idea that you can't go in and take life without hurting yourself. Of course, that's been said in the East from time out of mind, right? But this is a new idea for the West, that our soldiers are getting hurt because they're hurting people. Because we've evolved to the point in war where we can protect our soldiers so well that they very rarely die through physical injury on the battlefield anymore. But they're dying a lot at their own hands. And moral injury is part of that. So it's something, it's something that we're going to have to really grapple with, is what are the causes of trauma in the human mind. And humans evolved to be cooperative, interdependent beings. We really aren't killers. That's not our nature as a species.
And it's interesting because I was just thinking of the movie A Scent of a Woman, and Al Pacino says that toward the end of the movie. He says, what you were trying to do is execute this boy's soul. And that he had been in wars and that he had seen, young men with their arms torn off and their legs torn off, but there was nothing more troubling than, the amputation of a soul. There is no prosthetic for that. And you see people where that happens. For instance, it could be at a job where a boss says you're not really living up to your potential. But they go beyond that. They decide they're going to reach in there and they're going to scramble and tear up who you are. It's not what your performance is, but it's who you are.
Yeah.
And you see this, and to say, for instance, there's no prosthetic for that. Right. You just have to imagine that this is something a person needs to overcome to get back away from the sin that they've ever felt or come to believe they were ever less than.
Right.
It's a pretty incredible obstacle to help somebody through, and that you do this.
Oh my
I can
goodness,
see where you get the kind of pleasure from this kind of work when they smile just like anybody would, coming out of the darkness and feeling the sun on their face, and to smell the scent of the flowers, for instance. That is very rewarding.
Yes.
I would imagine.
Yes, and sometimes the work's very long and slow, but I had a client who really had so much trauma growing up that she could not even imagine or conceive of any sort of benevolent mother figure. And for 7 years, she had dreams about me abusing her. But she kept coming, she kept working at it. She sensed that I could help her. And, finally after 7 years, she had this dream about a mama whale and a baby whale. And she could feel it. She could feel the love. She could feel this maternal love. It was new for her. It was completely new, And so even though it took 7 years, I live for moments like that. They're so beautiful, when you help a struggling being, move into life in that way.
Well, and there's that, and then they begin to realize the possibilities within their lives. And a lot of times people who come from this place, just go on to do amazing things that even surprise them.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. They're like, converts almost. They have they can have the zealousness of converts. Like they have all this energy freed up from healing, or just from releasing what you were describing earlier about this way of shaming the self is what I call toxic shame.
Mm-hmm.
You know, parents do it all the time. I write about that in one of my chapters about how there's a difference between saying to a young child, I'm sorry, no, you can't have that, but I can see why you'd like it, and saying, you're a bad boy for even wanting that. Like, how dare you want that? You know, and that's toxic. And a lot of children are still raised in that kind of toxic pedagogical model.
Mm-hmm.
Alice Miller has written very brilliantly about that in the German and Swiss cultures. She's a Swiss psychoanalyst. She wrote this book, For Your Own Good, where she talks about that kind of toxic shame dynamic that goes on. So, you know, you don't have to be sexually abused to have toxic shame. You know,
right.
There's lots of ways to get it. And people can be traumatized by words as much or more. Interestingly, some of the clients, the pain they had the most was honestly the neglect. People I struggled the most with and who struggled the most with me were people who had this no sense of love, like this client I just described. No sense of love in their life at all.
Healing mind, body, spirit, and community, one symptom at a time. That's true that we can all do this with the Trauma Toolkit. Is there a website people can find out more about this?
Sure. They can go to www.supb, PB like peanut butter, .com, or supeasbannet.com, which is my website. And there's a lot about the book and me on that website and my services, and people want to know.
It's fantastic to know people just like you are out there doing the kind of work that you do. It's never easy, but it's highly rewarding, as things like that tend to be. Susan, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And one more time on your website.
www.supb.com.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
All right, take care.
We encourage you, the listeners, find out and explore that. If you feel that there's a way that you need to move past where you're at, you're feeling a little stuck, or you know somebody who can use that extra helping hand, it's your responsibility to be sure to lead the way. Find out more also by exploring Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. We do have a weekly e-news update for you to sign up and enjoy and share with others as well. I'm Daniel Davis. This is Beyond 50. Thank you for tuning in, and remember, live your day past halfway.